Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this podcast episode. Today I'm going to be giving you some tips on how to address racism and oppression, and I hope that you enjoy this. And my name is Taib K.Boyce. Again, I am a anti-racism facilitator and consultant. I run TKB Consulting, which is a firm I've developed to help organizations like yourself build the capacity for anti-racism and oppression within their staff and workplace. Racism does affect how people navigate the world, and oppression affects how people navigate the world. So we have to acknowledge that these isms exist. And I want us to begin this conversation with that understanding collectively that these isms exist, and so that we can work towards changing that behavior. So now I want to give some tips on how to address racism or oppression in the workplace. And I've divided this portion of the podcast into 2 segments. So I'm going to give some general advice on how to address issues that might come up within your organization or externally. Either way, this advice is useful. So this is going to be general advice that I'm going to give, but then also I want to provide some specific advice for non-able-bodied BIPOC individuals so that they can receive some specific tools in order to address issues around race or oppression that they might face as well. So I've divided the next portion into those 2 sections. To begin, we're going to have a conversation about the art of the apology. This methodology was developed by Rania Al-Mugammar. This is a consultant based from last I checked, Toronto. And this is the art of the apology. There are a couple steps that involved in the art of the apology. First, it is acknowledgement. So what you want to do is you want to acknowledge that this happened, or you've bared witness to something happening. You want to refrain from perfectly logical explanations to kind of push back what you've experienced or what you've bared witness to. For example, perfectly logical explanations to absolve someone from acknowledging something is to say that they're just having a bad day, they're new to the job, they are unfamiliar with this colleague, they're new to the city. These are all ways that people have absolved themselves from responsibility and accountability. And we want to move away from that. Instead, when we're dealing with addressing an issue of racism or oppression, you want to acknowledge what's happened. And this involves thinking critically about the context and the world that gaslights individuals, communities, into believing that their experiences of oppression are fragmented incidents and not part of a larger system that supports and enables violence and marginalization of their communities. And I said this word, gaslighting. What is gaslighting? So from my perspective, gaslighting is when someone is making efforts to erase or downplay someone's concerns, legitimate concerns, in order to shift blame onto them. That's what gaslighting is. So in order to address an ism, you have to refrain from gaslighting and instead acknowledge and support. So that's the first thing, acknowledgement. And that includes not gaslighting and not creating perfectly logical explanations for racism or oppression. Okay, so the next step in the art of the apology that Rania describes is emotional uptake. So you want to create space for folks to feel their feelings without feeling policed on the appropriateness or validity of their emotional response to something. So give space for the emotions that might come up from these type of experiences. That's step 2. Okay, so step 3 is you need to center the hurt. This involves not talking about your feelings of guilt, but instead the feelings and needs of those you've harmed or that have been harmed. Those who've been harmed shouldn't have to support you during an apology, nor should they have to coach or cheer for you as well. So, in other words, center the hurt of the organization or the group or the individual who is experiencing the effects of racism or oppression, rather than saying things like, for example, I feel guilty, I would have never done this, or this is making me so sad. In those expressions, you're centering your emotions, your hurt, and not the hurt of the other party. So you want to refrain from that. So that's number 3. Center the hurt. Number 2, emotional uptake. And number 1, accountability. Okay, so now we're going to talk about number 4. So number 4 is accountability and change behavior. So what you want to do is you want to take ownership of your actions. You want to name and understand them and change the identified problem or behavior patterns that amount to what happened. So what you want to do is you want to not provide irrelevant context or justification to minimize the impact of your action. So how is acknowledgement and accountability different? So acknowledging something is to understand that this happened, great, but when you're doing accountability, now you're taking ownership of the actions. Yes, we know that it's happened, great, we've established that, but now who is going to take responsibility? Who is going to be at the forefront of owning these actions and working towards changing that behavior? And it'd be beneficial for you to either have someone in your organization who's able to be accountable for these type of issues, whether that's your executive director or your manager or your HR supervisor. These are all people who, in my experience, have been the people to spearhead accountability and change in behavior within an organization. So I highly encourage you to have a group or an individual be that mechanism for accountability and change behavior. So that involves identifying the problem and the patterns that have taken place and working towards not justifying, not minimizing their impact, but working towards understanding their impact and ensuring that what has taken place doesn't happen again. And the methods or the ways that you do that are going to be different for each organization in terms of prevention. However, I support you finding someone within your organization who can be leading that conversation about what that change in behavior can look like. Okay, so the last step in the art of the apology is really important. The last step is divest from forgiveness. So what does that mean? So from my perspective, what you need to do is apologize without expecting closure. A lot of times people apologize expecting someone to apologize for something that they've done or to be forgiven. However, that is not what should be on the table when apologizing for an issue around racism or oppression. So you want to invest in the labor of reconciliation. You want to divorce from the appeasing of feelings of guilt and focusing on healing and supporting those we've harmed. Apologizing without forgiveness as a target, but healing regardless of whether you've been forgiven or not. Forgiveness is not the goal. Healing is. Healing of the person who's been wrong, the group that's been wrong. Forgiveness does of the transgressor. The transgressor receiving forgiveness doesn't ultimately lead to the healing of the person or the group that's been affected, right? So in the art of the apology, we want to ensure that the person who's being centered or the group that's being centered is the one that's been affected negatively or impacted by the racism or the oppression. So forgiveness is not the goal, healing is the goal. And the way to do that is to divest from forgiveness. Remove forgiveness from your vocabulary, from your expectations, so that a true apology can be able to flourish. Okay, so I just want to recap. What is the art of the apology? There's 5 aspects to it. There's acknowledgement, emotional uptake, centering hurt, accountability and change behavior, and then there's also divest from forgiveness. So those are the 5 things that I'd like to leave you with in terms of how to generally handle an issue of racism or oppression within your organization or externally. Okay, so now that I've talked a little generally about how to address racism and oppression, I want to talk specifically now to non-able-bodied BIPOC staff members that you have or people that are within your organization or outside your organization that you might interact with. I'm speaking specifically to non-able-bodied, non-heteronormative folks who are BIPOC. I'm speaking to you. So talking about profiling, talking about racial injustice in the workplace is really taxing on folks who are non-able-bodied or BIPOC or like the intersections of those identities. It's taxing to always feel like you're having to explain who you are when you come in the room and advocate for yourself because the world isn't built to promote non-able-bodied BIPOC folk, non-heteronormative folks. So, and by non-heteronormative, I mean people who are not heterosexual. So anyone who's non-heterosexual, the world isn't built for you. So I'm going to give you some pointers on how to set boundaries for self-care for Black and people of color and Indigenous folks. First of all, don't feel obligated to talk about these issues with anyone. Only those who you feel comfortable with and trust. Have a colleague or a supervisor who you can confide in for these issues that might come up, because that'll be much better than you trying to speak with someone who you don't have trust with. So build that trustful relationship if you don't have one. If you're not able to have one, I think you can look into other ways of addressing your concerns, which I'll get into. But my first piece of advice to folks who are non-able-bodied BIPOC individuals, Black, Indigenous people of color, is to not feel obligated to talk about these issues around racism and oppression if you don't feel like you want to. Set clear boundaries for yourself that because there's a issue around racism and oppression and that might encompass your lived experience, doesn't mean that you have to be the token spokesperson for everyone who is within those equity-seeking groups, like people who are queer, people who are Indigenous, Black, people of color. You don't need to be the person who's always speaking on behalf of them. Find someone who's able to have your confidence and speak with them about the issues that you might have. Set clear boundaries with your colleagues on that topic. And speaking of that, refuse to enter debates or requests for lived experience. So what I mean by that is you don't need to prove to anyone what your lived experience is. So if someone is saying to you, I don't think all Black people are like that, or I don't think someone who's in a wheelchair really is suffering that much, why do you, who is it for them to judge you? And why should you have to try and prove your lived experience and your trauma to someone who doesn't get it? So that'd be my next piece of advice. Feel secure in your lived experience and don't feel the necessity, I should say, to prove your lived experience to anyone. I would also say my next piece of advice is delete messages and ignore triggering footage shared with you. So if there's a point where there's content being shared that is offensive to you, you don't have to have that in your face, and you can make efforts to remove it and from your computer, for example, or from the office space. Make that boundary known to your colleagues that messages that are triggering towards you shouldn't be available in the workplace. That's another clear boundary I think is important. So as well, remember you're allowed to say no to things like requests to educate folks or share your trauma. So that's goes in hand with not having to prove your lived experience. So oftentimes there's this concept called trauma mining, which is where folks put an individual who has experienced a certain type of trauma at the center to try and sensationalize their experience without actually making any efforts to improve their experience. And what the end result is that person is left giving so much of themselves without getting much in return. So my other piece of advice in terms of setting boundaries is remember you're allowed to say no to a request from folks to educate them. You don't get paid to educate your colleagues on the issues that are affecting you. So therefore, don't work on the side of your desk on top of your work, trying to educate folks on things that they should be paying someone to educate them on. And it sets that clear boundary between you and your colleagues that I'm here to do my job. I'm not here to bring forward your racial reawakening. That's not in my job description. So essentially setting that boundary as well. And I'd also like to say that it's important to tell yourself that it is okay to access well-being support such as counseling or therapy and rest and time off. So it's so important to take those days off, those sick days, as mental health break days, in order to ensure that you're the best when you go into work. And access to therapy is something also that I advocate if that's something that you're able to have access to. Don't feel ashamed or discouraged to take time off if that's what's needed. And then my last boundary that I'd like to share for self-care with you folks is if conversations are triggering you, remember you can walk away, switch off your camera, end the call, or change the subject. So that being said, you don't have to engage in conversations that are uncomfortable or awkward to appease your staff colleagues. I think that is so important for BIPOC, non-able-bodied folks to center their own well-being in these situations and remove any triggering aspects, right? And so if you're working virtually, shut your camera off. If you're talking in person, say, you know what, I'm actually not comfortable talking about this subject right now. Maybe we can talk about something else and switch the subject, because we don't have to engage in conversations that are triggering, and especially in the workplace. So this resource that I was speaking to is this advice on boundaries and self-care for Black people and BIPOC folks was developed by Haley TVB. So you can go to tvb.co.uk to look at the resource that I'm referencing in this advice. It's really good in terms of like how people who are non-able-bodied BIPOC can set boundaries in the workplace. And I'm sharing that with you today in this podcast. So I think that's it for me in terms of what I wanted to share with you folks around advice. This is not an exhaustive list in terms of what you could do to address racism or oppression in the workplace or within your organization. But I think this is a great starting point. In terms of the art of an apology, it's a great way to have the conversations that haven't been had in the past. In terms of like BIPOC setting boundaries for self-care, I thought this was an important aspect to tackle in this podcast because oftentimes we're always focusing on the transgressor, but we're not really centering the health and healing of the person who's been transgressed. So that's why I added this aspect in terms of like how to set boundaries. Because as we do this work as an organization, oftentimes it gets put on the shoulders of the token racialized, non-able-bodied, queer, trans person at the organization. And it shouldn't be that way. And if it is, that's why we've come up with some of these boundaries, because we are not meant to be the arbiters of your racial awakening, as I've said. We're meant to be there as staff members, as participants of your services, and we deserve to be in a space that is welcoming and also enriching. And if I have any final words to say, I'll say this. The greatest way that you can contribute to improving your organization is to uplift those who have made it their mission to put this work forward. So remove any obstacles that have been in place. If there's policies, if there's a culture of history at the organization that is a barrier, address them and remove them. And the way to know how to identify those policies and cultures is to hire an expert who can support you in identifying like what those barriers are within your organization. A professional like myself, or there's many others within the field, to help you sift through how to do better as an organization and as an individual. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm so thankful to the Ottawa Festival Network for giving me the opportunity to record this podcast. Please contact me at my website, TKB Consulting, or via Twitter at Taib Boyce. So it's my first name and my last name minus one B, Taib Boyce, but just one B, TAIBOYCE on all social media platforms. And thank you for joining me today. And this is me signing off.
And that wraps up this episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, presented by Ottawa Festival Network. All of the resources and links mentioned throughout this episode will be available in the episode show notes, as well as transcriptions in both French and English. For information on OFN and its membership, please check us out online at ottawasfestivals.ca. If you have any questions or feedback on this podcast, you can email us at festforward@ottawafestivals.ca. Thank you so much for listening, and please remember to subscribe to Fest Forward Advisor Talks to catch future episodes, where we will dive into even more hot topics festival and event organizations need to know to support and grow their organizations. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your colleagues and friends and leave us a review. That's all for now. Stay tuned and stay festive.